Steve had been hustling alone in the bustling big city for what felt like an eternity. Back when he first packed his bags and headed for the big city, he was armed with ambition and dreams so vivid they seemed inevitable. But now, those dreams felt like distant echoes, lost in the relentless grind, a whole decade of sacrifices. He'd scraped and clawed through a tough-as-nails life, juggling endless bills and nursing the scars of a love story that had crumbled to dust. Despite all he gave up, his time, energy, even pieces of himself, his dreams slipped further and further away. Friends he used to lean on had all moved on, drifting to their own lives, leaving Steve behind as if he were a memory they were happy to forget. Out of options and with nothing left to fight for, Steve made the tough call to pack it all in. He sold what little he had left, bought a ticket, and made the journey back to his hometown. But instead of a hero's welcome, Steve walked straight into judgment. His mother sighed, muttering how her son had returned empty-handed after all those years in the city, only to add more burden to the family. His father, visibly irritated, made no effort to hide his disappointment. "Find a job," he barked, expecting Steve to leap into action. But Steve, drained and disillusioned, spent his days sprawled on the couch, too defeated to care. His sister wasn't any more forgiving. She threw out cold, cutting words without hesitation. That night, as Steve tried to explain himself, to share his struggles, his sister turned away, her icy indifference like a slap to his face. The next morning, under pressure from all sides, Steve was shoved out the door to hunt for a job. Interview after interview he tried, but luck wasn't on his side. He bombed every attempt, his nerves and self-doubt tripping him up at every turn. Frustrated beyond belief, his father decided to step in. Dragging Steve along, he paid a visit to a friend, a car rental mogul with a shiny reputation. But as if the universe were playing a cruel joke, they arrived in the middle of a full-blown domestic meltdown between the friend and his wife. Eventually, the argument got so heated that the friend had to be rushed to the hospital, leaving Steve and his dad stuck in awkward silence. Out of ideas and running out of patience, Steve's father directed him toward a cashier job at a local store. Reluctantly, Steve queued up, but fate wasn't done with its twists. As he stood there, he ran into Jane, his high school's golden girl. Back in the day, Jane was the shining star, the center of attention, everything Steve wasn't. While he had been the quiet guy who stayed on the fringes, she had owned the spotlight. Time had been kind to Jane. She had become a successful TV reporter, making waves and chasing stories. Seeing Steve in line, she couldn't resist her curiosity, asking him how his life had been after 10 years in the big city. Steve's stomach churned. He couldn't admit to his failures, so he lied. With an awkward smile, he shrugged, claiming he'd retired and was just here for the heck of it. But Jane wasn't buying it. The very fact that he was in that line gave him away. Later that day, Steve returned home, only to face his father's wrath. When asked about the cashier job, Steve dismissed it, saying he wasn't suited for it. His curt response only fueled his father's anger. His father reached for something to throw in frustration, but his mother and sister intervened, stopping him before things escalated. Taking a softer approach, his mother pep-talked Steve down while shopping in the store, offering advice instead of scolding. She told him it was time to step up, to be a responsible brother and a decent role model for his sister. She acknowledged he was old enough to shape his life however he wanted, but reminded him that setting a good example mattered. Then, as a lighthearted endnote, she plopped down in the massage chair she always wanted and joked about how she'd be grateful if Steve bought her one someday. Before Steve could fully process the day, his phone buzzed. It was Jane, asking to meet. Broke and unsure of how to even get through the day without help, Steve swallowed his pride and borrowed a little cash from his mom. Meeting Jane at a restaurant, they spent time reminiscing about high school. Steve didn't have much to say. His life back then had been uneventful and ordinary. What he didn't realize was that Jane had once seen him differently. Back in school, she'd admired his quiet charm, the way he carried himself with a cool confidence, but those were things in the past. Now, she had her own story, a family, a career, and most recently, a divorce. Sensing an opening, Steve tried to turn on the charm, but Jane stopped him cold. Instead, she laid out her predicament. Her boss at the TV station had tasked her with creating a heart-touching documentary. Initially, Jane had planned to feature a war veteran, but tragedy struck, and her subject passed away before filming began. Scrambling for a new angle, she pitched the idea of documenting Steve's life, a man who went to the city chasing dreams, only to return home empty-handed. Steve was stunned. Not only had his lie been exposed, but Jane was offering him a chance to turn his failures into something meaningful. Memories of high school flooded back. his old notebooks filled with scripts, the dreams he once had of telling stories through film. Encouraged by his mother's discovery of those dusty pages, Steve felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't easy, but he pushed his pride aside. For the sake of his dream, for the chance to create something real, Steve said yes. The next morning, Steve found himself in front of the camera, ready for his interview. Jane, ever the perfectionist, directed him to share his life in the big city. The highs, the lows, the struggles. But Steve, never one for eloquence, stumbled over his words. Take after take, Jane tried to coax the story out of him, but his awkwardness proved too much. Frustrated, she eventually gave up on the idea of focusing solely on Steve. Instead, she shifted her lens to his family, hoping to capture a more emotional angle. But that plan backfired spectacularly. To his family, Steve was nothing more than a failed middle-aged man, a disappointment who had returned home empty-handed. Desperate to salvage the project, Jane resorted to staging a scene where Steve handed his mother money, supposedly earned through hard work. In reality, the cash was just a prop, a hollow gesture for the sake of the documentary. Jane's boss wasn't impressed. He tore into her work, dismissing the documentary as nothing more than a dull portrayal of an unemployed man. Knowing this wouldn't work as they imagined, he gave her more time to figure out a new direction. Jane, determined to turn things around, sat down with Steve to brainstorm. She didn't sugarcoat her critique, calling his life uneventful and uninspiring. Steve, knowing it was all true, had no defense. Then Jane remembered the script book Steve's mother had shown her, a collection of stories Steve had written back in high school. One story, a touching tale of an elderly couple's love, stood out. Jane suggested they turn it into a film. Steve, energized by the idea, gathered his family to discuss the plan. He pitched it as foolproof, a chance to create something meaningful, but he needed their help. His mother and father to play the lead roles, and Wanda to assist with the production. His family agreed, but only on one condition. Steve had to fund the project himself. With no money to his name, Steve scrambled for a solution. He decided to sell an antique vase from the house, hoping it would fetch enough to cover the costs. But at the pawn shop, the owner dismissed the vase as worthless. Defeated, Steve took it back home. Seeing her son struggle, Steve's mother stepped in. She handed him a book from the cupboard, and inside, Steve found a wad of cash. It was his mother's savings, offered to him as the capital for his film. With the funds secured, Steve dove into preparations. But there was one major hurdle. His father refused to act, claiming he couldn't perform in front of a camera. Steve was on the verge of giving up when his mother suggested an alternative. She introduced him to Harry, an old friend and a former theater actor with a reputation in the sub-district. Harry, she believed, was perfect for the role. Wasting no time, Steve brought Harry on board, and the shooting began. Despite the tight budget, the production exceeded Steve's expectations. His mother and Wanda embraced the process, enjoying every moment. But challenges cropped up. Technical issues like dead batteries and a camera that refused to cooperate. Then there was Steve's father, whose jealousy over his wife's chemistry with Harry caused tension. At one point, his father even banned filming at home, claiming his acoustic club needed the space for practice. Steve, unwilling to argue, agreed to relocate the shoot. But the new location brought its own problems. As the camera rolled, a security guard interrupted, demanding a permit to use the space. Steve, thinking on his feet, tried to bribe the guard with a cigarette and even offered him a role in the film. Unfortunately, the plan fell flat. Out of options, the team returned home, setting up the shoot on the balcony. But Steve's father, still stewing in jealousy, confronted them. He argued that it was inappropriate for his wife to act alongside another man, especially in intimate scenes. Steve, caught in the crossfire, suggested his father take the lead role if he was so uncomfortable. Ignoring the drama, Steve pressed on, driven by his dream. That night, Steve revised the script, struggling to adapt it to the realities of the shoot. Jane, noticing his frustration, offered to help. Together, they read through the script, their focus shifting from the words to each other. Their gazes met, a moment charged with unspoken emotions. Whether it was admiration or something deeper, neither could say. As the project neared completion, Steve's dream was finally within reach. But behind the scenes, Jane had been recording every moment, capturing the raw, unfiltered reality of the journey. Among the footage was a moment that would haunt Steve forever. The discovery that his mother had passed away. The entire filming process came to an abrupt halt, overtaken by a tragedy far greater than any production. Steve's mother had passed away, her sudden departure delivering a crushing blow to the family. For Steve, it was a loss that left him feeling unmoored. But for his father, the grief was utterly debilitating. He spent days in the funeral home, motionless in his chair, clinging to the impossible hope that his beloved wife would somehow return. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Jane's documentary about Steve's life was finally complete. Yet instead of feeling pride or relief, she was overwhelmed by guilt. This wasn't the kind of project she had envisioned. Jane resigned from her position, not because she didn't want the promotion, but because she couldn't accept an achievement that had come at the expense of her friend's suffering. To her, the documentary was no longer a piece of work. It was a painful reminder of how she had inadvertently exposed Steve during one of the darkest times in his life. In her eyes, Steve had transformed from just a subject of her story to someone who truly mattered. The guilt of hurting him weighed heavily on her heart. Back at home, Steve and Wanda were stunned when they saw Jane's documentary broadcast on TV. It chronicled everything: the struggles, the heartbreaks, the raw moments that Steve thought had been private. Their family became the talk of the town, but while the attention made Steve uncomfortable, his father seemed fixated on something else entirely. Every night, he watched the documentary over and over again, focusing solely on the scenes where his wife appeared. It was as if those fragments of her presence offered him a small solace amidst the overwhelming grief. For Steve, life felt heavier than ever. The laziness that had once defined his days gave way to an emptiness that seemed insurmountable. The house echoed with silence, yet his mother's voice, her nagging, her scolding, still lingered in his memory. Each time he passed the massage chair she had longed for, he felt the sting of regret, knowing he had never been able to buy it for her. One quiet day, as Steve drifted into a daydream, his mother's shadow seemed to return. Memories of her filled his mind, how she'd always taken care of the house with dedication and pride, even though she had once been a top graduate with numerous career opportunities. She had chosen love over ambition, leaving behind a promising future to build a life with her husband. People might have seen their life as flawed, but his mother had embraced it with grace. Steve remembered asking her why she believed women needed to be educated, and her chuckling reply, not to outshine their husbands, but to raise their children well. In that vision, Steve also asked his mother why he had turned out to be a failure. Her response stayed with him, a gentle smile, her gaze filled with understanding as she said, "Success isn't always about money or possessions, and failure isn't always a bad thing. Never lose yourself chasing after what others think you should achieve. True success is bringing happiness to others." Her wisdom began to heal the cracks in Steve's heart, but before he could dwell further, his father approached him with an unexpected request. "Finish the film," he said, his voice filled with determination. He would do whatever it took to help Steve complete it, not just for the sake of the project, but so he could see his beloved wife one last time. 3 years passed since the loss of Steve's mother, and the weight of grief began to wear on his father's health. When Steve's father passed away a month later, the sorrow deepened. Yet, Steve and Wanda made it a ritual to visit their parents' graves, bringing along the items their mother and father had cherished but never received in life. It was their way of honoring them, of keeping their memory alive. Steve eventually found himself working as a taxi driver, while his sister Wanda pursued her dream of opening a fitness center with a friend in another city. Knowing she would need all the help she could get, Steve handed her his ATM card, offering her the savings he'd set aside. It wasn't much, but it was everything he had, a gesture that spoke of his quiet love for his sister. Wanda, taken aback, finally understood the depth of her brother's care and affection. One ordinary day, as Steve drove a passenger through the city streets, he spotted Jane. She had returned to her husband and was surrounded by her children, radiating happiness. Steve felt no bitterness, only a calm acceptance. He realized that life was a mosaic of joy and sorrow, a balance that everyone carried in their own way. Arriving home, Steve braced himself for the quiet emptiness that had become his new normal. No more nagging from his mother, no angry outbursts from his father, no playful mischief from Wanda. But that day, he received news that turned everything around. His short film had won an award at the biggest film festival in China. Wanda, unbeknownst to him, had submitted it in secret. At the end of the broadcast, a clip of his father played, a message of love and pride. "They may not be great in the eyes of others," his father said, "but to me, my children are the most meaningful thing in my life. Live your lives as best as you can."